Who do you say that I am? Perhaps you've had a chance to learn a little bit about me, whether it's from reading in the bulletins or newsletters and all that. Even if you haven't seen any of that, you have probably seen that I have doctor in front of my name, that I'm wearing these robes from England. England has a different tradition in academic robes, and that's why mine are colorful, not black. They don't have these stripes and it has a close in front. But what really does all of that doctoral stuff mean? Does it mean I have all the answers? Of course it does. A PhD is an intense study in a specific area, and that's it. So I may know quite a bit about Jacques Ellul, the Frenchman that I studied, but that doesn't necessarily mean I know any more about God. And it doesn't mean that I do know God. My PhD is in theology, but what is theology? It's nothing more and nothing less than talk about God. That's all. Just talking about God. When a child asks where God lives, that is theology. When a person is struggling with life and wonders if there really is a God who cares, they are doing theology. When an academic sits down to write many volumes of work about God, that is also theology. So you see, theology isn't just for academics or pastors. Anybody can do it. When you pray, you are doing theology. And when you sing a hymn or praise song, you are doing theology. And when we talk about God, what or who are we talking about? Theology is our talk. We are the ones talking. This means that everything that you and I say about God begins with us. What we think about God has all sorts of background. How we were raised, what our experiences have been, what country we live in, what language we speak, and whether we are rich or poor, happy or sad, healthy or ill. When we talk about God, we are always involving ourselves. So it's especially important that we know ourselves and be aware of our prejudices. For otherwise, God just becomes who we want him to be. Jesus encounters this same issue when he speaks about the crowds and when he talks with his disciples. So let us read from Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 23. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged his disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, you are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men." Who do you say that I am? This is the question that lies at the heart of the gospel. And this question is the main important question of all of theology, of all of our talk about God. Who is God? Now, Jesus isn't interested in knowing facts about himself. He's interested in knowing the perception that his disciples have of him. Who do you say that I am? This is the question Jesus is asking of you. He's not asking you to explain in great detail all the facts about his life or what people have believed about him in the past. He wants to know your heart and your mind. Everyone seems to know who Jesus is. Hundreds of books have been written about him. From the German scholar David Strauss's Das Leben Jesu, The Life of Jesus, which began a revolution in critical scholarship in 1835, where he looked for the historical Jesus as opposed to the Christ that people really believe about, all the way until the recent Killing Jesus by Bill O'Brien. All manner of people have tried to say something more about Jesus than the rather small amount that we read in Scripture. But all of these books circle around the person. Except for the New Testament, we have no written record of people who actually interacted with the man himself. And to write a solid biography of him really, in a way, seems absurd. If we compare him to Julius Caesar, to Napoleon, or to Winston Churchill, men for whom we have all sorts of documentation, who wrote their own biographies even. We know what the crowds say about Jesus. The crowds say that he was a first-century Jew who was executed on trumped-up charges. The crowds say that he was a teacher of good morality, along with Siddhartha Gautama, who is the Buddha, or Socrates, or Martin Luther King Jr. The crowds say that he was a man who was misunderstood by a bunch of radical followers. The crowds say that he maybe had a wife, or had illegitimate children with Mary Magdalene. The crowds say that he certainly did not do most of the miracles, and obviously he did not raise from the dead. But the crowds say that he is a valuable figure to give health to our tradition. David Cameron, who is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, recently explained that Britain needs to be more confident of the fact that it is a Christian nation. He wrote in an Easter message that, and I quote, "Crucially, the Christian values of responsibility, hard work, charity, compassion, humility, and love are shared by people of every faith and none." You see, David Cameron's faith is that of the crowd. His is a Jesus who teaches good moral principles. And everybody should be respected because of it. Cameron is a member of the Church of England, and he says, "I suspect a rather classic one, not that regular in attendance, and a bit vague on some of the more difficult parts of the faith. This is the faith of a statesman who, with power, who sees in Christianity a message that upholds the important values of civilization. But Jesus for him is not someone who could question his own power or his own policies." Now the crowds in Jesus' day were on the opposite side of the power structure. They didn't want someone who would uphold the status quo. They wanted a Messiah, a Savior. We're accustomed to thinking of the Messiah, as someone who would save souls from sin. But in Jesus' day, this was not a current idea. They didn't think about it that way. What the Jews wanted was a political revolutionary leader. They wanted another Judas Maccabeus, a man who would galvanize the fighting spirit of the oppressed Jewish people and lead them to throw out the defiling presence of the Romans from the temple in Jerusalem. Judas Maccabeus, whose name means the hammer, threw out the Greeks from Jerusalem generations before. And since the time of the hammer, there had been many other messiahs, men who started revolutions, only to see them eventually crushed by the Romans. Was this who the crowds wanted in Jesus? Well, some of them for sure. Others saw Jesus as a prophet, like one of the great prophets of old. They saw Elijah, the wonder worker who miraculously made flour and oil multiply, and who even brought life back to a widow's dead son. But they also saw the Elijah who stood up to the wicked but successful King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, a man who did not fear what would come of him when he protested against their injustices and idolatry. What the Jews wanted was a national hero and religious renewal. Who do the crowds say that I am? You see, the word God and the name Jesus can mean almost anything you want them to mean. To many, God is the one who establishes social order, who underwrites systems of justice, who guarantees the value of the money for which we work worked so hard. God is the one who enforces peace and gives us victory in war. But what does that three-letter word, God, even mean? It's not actually the name of our God. In fact, it comes from our Germanic pagan heritage. It shouldn't surprise us then that nearly every nation in human history has had its own god or gods who did the same things for their people. So how do we know that our God is the living God and not just our own creation? Xenophanes of Colophon, an ancient Greek who lived from 570 to 475 BC, said that the Ethiopians make their gods black and snub-nosed. The Thracians say theirs have blue eyes and red hair. Don't we tend to portray Jesus as a long-haired Northern European? But who do you say that I am? Jesus turns his questioning to the disciples. The crowds don't really know Jesus. They know a little bit about him, and they'd like him to be on their side. They have heard about his miracles and his radical teachings. But the disciples, those who had spent significant time listening to Jesus' teachings, listening to him explain his miracles, and seeing him on a daily basis, they have a different perspective. It is Simon Peter who explains, "You are the Christ of God. You are the Messiah, the Anointed One, the one on a divine mission from God. You are the King in the line of David." For Peter, Jesus is the one for whom they'd all been waiting. He was going to fix everything. And in response to this expression of faith, Jesus gives Simon a new name. He calls him Peter, which means rock. For this faith is the firm foundation upon which the church is built. The rock of the church is knowing Jesus. In order to understand what it means to be United Presbyterian Church in Cañon City, we have to be able to answer the question, who do you say that I am? We have to be able to answer that by knowing Jesus himself. But Jesus goes on to say, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised." And Peter is taken aback. And he took Jesus aside and privately scolded him, saying, "God forbid, this will never happen to you." Jesus then rebukes Peter by saying, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." The things of man? The things of man? Peter just confessed that Jesus is the Messiah, the chosen one of God. Surely he is thinking of the things of God. Justice, liberty, overturning oppression. But Peter knows little about what the Messiah was really going to do. Has Jesus come as a man to conquer men, or as the Son of God to die by the hand of those who are looking for God to be on their side? So how do we know whether we follow the Christ of tradition or the real living God? How do we know if we are following the God of our own convenient design? We do theology. And that probably sounds like a very strange response. Theologians in the past have come up with all manner of crazy ideas. But theology is nothing more than talk about God. And good theology begins with what God has said about himself in his word. Who do you say that I am? This is what theology is all about. Who is God? Who is Jesus? Let's talk about it. That's why I'm here, and I hope that's why many of you are here. Now, if we're going to do good theology and not just make it all up, we need a source of authority. We need something to which we can turn to know about God. Some people advocate turning to reason, turning to tradition, turning to experience or to nature. But how can we know God from reason? Maybe all we're doing is exploring the shape of the human mind. This was the finding of most 20th century philosophy. Language is so important in shaping the way we think. And tradition, as we've already seen, is problematic. The Jews were expecting a political Messiah, but that's not who Jesus was. So tradition may not always be helpful. And what about experience? The problem is that all sorts of people have experiences of something they feel to be divine. And they have explained it in a wide variety of ways. Are we feeling the same God and calling him by different names? I was told this by a man just the other day, that we're all basically seeking the same thing, just spirituality. Or are we feeling something human that we feel we must label divine? And what about nature? Can we know God by looking at rocks and trees? I think we tend to find what we want to find in nature. The heavens declare the glory of God, but they do not reveal God himself. We have to already know God in order to understand how nature glorifies God. So if we can't turn to all of our normal sources of authority, then how can we know who Jesus is? What if God told us a story about himself and his relationship with people? What if instead of turning to human wisdom, experience, tradition, or authority, we turn to the divine story? This would mean that instead of having proof texts to get God to agree with our opinions, we would turn to a story and find ourselves in its midst. If the Bible is a story, and I think it really is, it's one big story from beginning to end, then how can we know God if we only pick and choose certain parts of the story? Most of us would like to just turn to certain scenes and imagine that that's the whole of the story. It's easy to have Jesus without bothering with the long genealogies and strange laws of Numbers and Leviticus. It's easy to have the comforting Psalms and the practical Proverbs without the dark depression of Ecclesiastes. It's easy to concentrate on the story of creation and forget that God created the world for the purpose of bringing people into a relationship with himself. Jesus instructs his disciples not to tell anyone that he is the Christ. Why would he do this? For the very same reason he rebukes Peter. No one understood the true mission of the Messiah. If the disciples went around spreading the news that the Messiah had come before Jesus had died and risen again, people would have flocked to him and proclaimed him as a king, as much like they did in his triumphal entry. They would have tried to make him into who they wanted him to be. The same thing is true of us. We mustn't go around telling people about Jesus if we don't really know who he is. Otherwise, we just turn him into what we want him to be. Jesus just becomes a name we use to express ourselves, to link our desires with an authoritative tradition. So before we go out into the world and tell them about this man named Jesus, it would be helpful for us to know who he is, to put him in the context of the story through which he revealed himself. And in telling others about Jesus, we aim to introduce them to a person we know, not to a set of ideas we think are correct. As I said last week, and you'll hear it again and again, if your relationship with Christ is the most important relationship you have, it will transform all your other relationships into the image of Christ's own relationship with him. You will love others just as Christ loves them. The kind of relationship you have with other people will be just like the relationship that Christ has with them. Who do you say that Jesus Christ is? This is the fundamental question of Christian faith. So in order to understand who we are as Christians, and then eventually in order to understand who we are as Presbyterians, we have to first know who Jesus is and put ourselves in this long story. Next week, I will begin preaching through the Bible, from beginning to end, as the weeks progress. Obviously, I won't be touching on everything. There's more books than there are weeks in the year. But I will be touching on the high points to show how it is one big story, how we can understand ourselves as part of this story, and see Jesus in the proper context. So hear the voice of God asking you today, who do you say that I am?